about our own efforts and the work that we need to do in the future. And as an organization, our commitment to putting equity in the center of our programming and our communications and our fundraising work. And when I looked around the Chesapeake, it did not see that we were doing or understood what community-centric fundraising was as a movement. Certainly it wasn't on my radar as an organization. So it felt really important to bring this national level conversation to the Chesapeake as we all continue to figure out what it means to center equity in all of the different work that we do. So at this point, I will hand it off to Rakhi and Alex to get us started with the presentation today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kate. Thank you for the welcome. And I know Rakhi and I are both excited to be joining this conversation. We see our role as facilitators and supporters. We're here to hold space for this really important discussion and just acknowledging that we're all continuing to work it out. And so to be patient with each other, to recognize that we want this to be iterative and just full of ideas and thoughts. And so as much interaction as you all can give it, that would be fantastic. And I'm going to turn it to Rakhi.
Awesome. Yes. Thanks, Alex. And thanks, Kate, for inviting us. We're really excited to have this conversation today with everyone. So thanks for joining this session. So today's session is called Introduction to Community-Centric Fundraising. The reality is we could have multiple different levels of conversations regarding this movement that was officially birthed last year during the pandemic. But this is more of a formal introduction to what the movement is, how it got started, and really what it's trying to do in the nonprofit sector. So it's just something to keep in mind is that we are currently streaming on 2 platforms, I believe. So we are on Zoom, which some of you might be in. We're also on Whova. So you can either post questions, comments, and ideas in the chat box on Zoom or using the Q&A or chat function on Whova. We will be monitoring both throughout this presentation. Awesome. So we're going to go ahead and start off with some good old introductions. My name is Rakhi. A physical description of myself for our low vision friends. I'm wearing a yellow shirt. I'm wearing glasses. My hair is pulled up in a bun. I am currently calling from Chicago, but I live on Tonkawa and Comanche land in Austin, Texas. I have been a fundraiser for about 11 years, working for a variety of organizations as a development director, as a grant writer, as a development consultant. And I am a member of the CCF Founding Council, which is a small group of 8 to 10 folks that have been sort of instrumental in launching this movement over the past year. I also am an organizer of the place-based group within the movement of CCF Texas, which is where some folks in Texas are just trying to localize some of the values of the movement and really make an impact, shifting the needle in the nonprofit world in Texas.
I guess that's transitioning to me. Thanks, Rakhi. I'm Alex Taylor. I'm a consultant with Nonprofit HR, which is a firm based out of the DMV area, but we all are around the country serving nonprofits, supporting nonprofits in a variety of ways, not just in HR, but in leadership development, DEI, strategic planning, all kinds of different things. And so thrilled to be here with you all today. I am a proud New Mexico resident. And so, but have only been here 2 months, so still learning all of the different tribal presences that are here. We have Apache and other tribes that were part of that were originally here, and now currently many Pueblos. There's 26 across the state of New Mexico. Santa Ana is very close to me, as well as Sandia and some others as well. And so those all kind of come around us, and we recognize a very interconnectedness with our Indigenous brothers and sisters, which is fantastic. Also, University of Houston graduate. I lived in Texas for a long time, got my master's there, 20 plus years in nonprofit work, including over 15 in the fundraising space. Was so privileged and just honored to find out about CCF over a year ago and get to join in with Rakhi and some other fantastic folks in Texas to get CCF Texas started. And now here in New Mexico, I'm trying to encourage the work here as well, and just be part of the team and the growth of this movement. So excited to be here with you all today. And I believe I'm taking us through this part as well. Sorry, Rakhi. Yeah, we're going to just come through our intro to the 10 principles. So we're going to do a little bit of acknowledgements and some things before we get into that. We're going to move through it relatively quickly because we want to get to some activity and interaction. Again, Rakhi said we could spend lots and lots of time going into these, and we have in our CCF Texas work, we have spent time really diving in kind of 2-3 principles at a time, breaking them down, talking about application, talking about how it could work in our contexts and different organizations. We're going to move through them a little more quickly, just making sure again that everyone's sort of familiar. We're going to talk about what they are and what they're not. We're going to talk about some stories of experience. So we always know when folks hear this, because I had the same reaction when I first was exposed to this idea of what community-centric fundraising looks like. How does this actually work? What does this actually look like in real life, right? Like, what is this? Are there organizations that are actually doing this? Is this happening? So we want to share some different ideas, and then we want to give you all lots of chances and opportunities throughout our 75 minutes together to talk about and start to kind of process and think about, or share if you're already doing it, how it might be working. And then Rakhi's going to take us through a really cool activity, this 15% solution piece here at the end. All right, I'll keep. So again, we want to acknowledge the land that we are on. And Rakhi and I had a really interesting conversation about this because, you know, the intent of acknowledging the land that we're on and who was here before settler colonialism came in is not just to be performative, not just to be able to say, oh, well, here's who I know the tribal names and I know what that looked like. And I understand, but it's to really ground in contemporary things that are happening. And so I even spent a little bit of time looking at for you all in the Chesapeake Bay area to acknowledge, and there are, you know, tens of thousands of people across your region who identify as Native American or Indigenous peoples in all 6 states that your watershed encompasses. There are a number of state and federally recognized tribes, as well as other organized groups who have shared heritage. And so I would just encourage you to spend some time. I'm not going to read all of this. It was just interesting to look it up. For example, the Commonwealth of Virginia has formally recognized 11 tribes. The state of Maryland has formally recognized 3, but there's all these other tribes that are part of the state and are part of the activity and work that are happening there. But part of it too is to then try to connect in with what's going on. And I found an interesting piece from last year that one of the tribes has joined the Oyster Alliance, which is a way to preserve, I think, and do good environmentally friendly work with oyster harvesting and growing of oysters in your region. And so there was some specific work that was being done and them joining in. So just we just share that to encourage you to find what's happening locally and try to connect in a way. So because it's not about ancient history, it's about what's happening right now. And so just wanted to call that out. Rakhi, was there anything else you wanted to share related to that?
Yeah, just to give folks a little bit more insight into our conversation. So I've been doing land acknowledgements for quite a while doing the work that I do. And Alex brought up a really good point that some Indigenous folks in her circle have seen it as performative or just unnecessary. And I think one of the ways that I encourage you all to make it less performative and really put some action behind the acknowledgement is the example comes from Seattle. So up there, the Duwamish tribe is the land that they are living on, and they actually have a real rent program where folks that are living in the Seattle area can pay back a monthly amount to the Duwamish people as a symbolic way to give reparations for the land that was stolen from them. We're not from the Chesapeake Bay area, so that may not exist yet, but that is definitely something, an example of an action that you can take to make it less performative of an acknowledgement. We also wanted to do something called a labor acknowledgement, which might be a little bit newer of a concept. I know it is for me. And a labor acknowledgement is basically a statement that recognizes that much of the economic progress and development in y'all's area is resulted from the unpaid labor and forced servitude of people of color, specifically African labor. So this is our labor acknowledgement. We also pause to recognize and acknowledge the labor upon which our country, state, and institutions are built. We remember that our country is built on the labor of enslaved people who were kidnapped and brought to the US from the African continent, and recognize the continued contribution of their survivors. We also acknowledge all immigrant labor, including voluntary, involuntary, trafficked, forced, and undocumented peoples who contributed to the building of this country and continue to serve within our labor force. We acknowledge all unpaid caregiving labor. Finally, we acknowledge that our institutions rely on hourly, student, contingent, and unpaid labor, and we recognize those contributions. I will go ahead and paste a little excerpt in the chat for those who have never heard a labor acknowledgement before, in case that's something you all want to incorporate into your work.
And I think this really highlights something that's really critical for this, which is this isn't just about looking at how you raise money and regrounding it in principles of equity and asking those hard questions. It's beginning the examination of everything we do organizationally. And that's a bedrock principle for CCF and for this equity approach to fundraising. So that's part of the reason we take some time here at the beginning to do this piece. All right. So this is our goals for our time, very short time together. Again, an intro to what CCF is. We're going to put links in the chat. I would strongly encourage you, if you haven't already, to go to the website for Community-Centric Fundraising. There's just a wealth of information there. Articles, blog posts, podcasts, upcoming events, all of that kind of thing. It's also where you can start to connect in with your local movement that's happening in the Chesapeake Bay area, or in Maryland or Virginia, in DC, that area. Start to see what's happening there and connect in. We are going to talk about the principles. We're going to talk about, like I said, Rakhi's going to take us through this activity, the last section of our time together that helps us really think about how we can incorporate it. We're going to hear those stories and then really think about, okay, well, what can I do with this? What does the first step look like for me or for my organization? Just a couple of things. Kate kind of touched on some of these things as well. You are muted unless we ask you to unmute, or if we have a point where we can ask. We've got about 30 folks on the workshop today, so it'll be a little bit tougher to monitor a lot of unmuting chat. So I would encourage you to use the chat and Q&A. Turn on your video if possible, but the session's being recorded, so just be aware of that. Breakouts will not be recorded. Consider including your pronouns. We already talked about that. Okay to be a human being with human life and responsibility. We're all calling in from different places with children and animals and other people in the background. And so we recognize that. We extend grace to each other in the midst of whatever is going on in life. And if you need to just take a break and go take care of something, that's totally fine as well. When we're in discussion, when you're sharing, either unmuting or chatting or in the Q&A, please speak from your own experience. We're not here to tell other people's stories. We're here to talk about our own. So let's be mindful of that and really speak from our own truth. And what's said here stays here, but what's learned here leaves here. I love that. And I've heard that in a couple of different contexts and just want to emphasize that. So the confidentiality of personal experiences and personal stories that are shared here, staying here, but the experience, the things that we're learning and what we want to take back absolutely needs to be carried forward.
Awesome. So now that we've introduced ourselves pretty extensively, we want to go ahead and hear from you all in terms of who's in this virtual room and space. So if you could go ahead and add to the chat box your name, pronouns, the organization that pays you or that you work for, or that you're representing in most of your day-to-day activities, and then your job title or role, or if you're looking for employment. We've actually seen quite a few folks connect in various CCF spaces that are looking to make moves in their career. So go ahead and put those key little details into the chat.
And if you're using the WUVA platform, if I can say it, Kate will let us know if there's folks that are coming in through that, Kate. So if you can kind of just let us know if anybody uses that to post that. We recognize we've kind of got dual things going on here, so we're going to do our best to try to acknowledge all of that. Got a few things here. Welcome.
Awesome. We got some DDs, development directors in the room.
Research assistants.
Yeah.
Technical environmental education.
CFOs. Awesome. I love when folks that are not just fundraisers show up to CCF things, because it's truly, I think it's a misnomer calling it community-centric fundraising. I think it's community-centric nonprofits. So it's really, really exciting to see all these folks here. An interim ED. I was one of those at one point in my life. I feel for you. Awesome. Heather, we see you, and when you're looking for employment, let us know. CCF, the CCF Slack community has a very robust opportunities channel where people are posting dozens of job postings every single day.
Yep.
So I highly recommend, I highly recommend looking at that when you are ready. Awesome. Okay, so these might continue to roll in. We can go ahead into the next slide, Alex. So the second thing we want you to all to share in the chat box is one word to describe your current familiarity with CCF. Again, CCF standing for the Community-Centric Fundraising Movement, officially birthed in the summer of 2020. And or, if you're already familiar with it, one word to describe how you are currently feeling about incorporating CCF principles into your work. Newbie, learning, unfamiliar, awesome. Newbie, new. I love it. Info, here to learn. So many new folks. I'm so excited. This is the perfect session for you all then. We're not gonna get too deep. Minimal and eager. Great. Awesome. Okay, great. Well, I'm so glad to hear that there's so many new folks. Part of what really excites me is like spreading the values of the movement to more and more folks in the nonprofit sector. So mission accomplished today. Awesome. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and start talking about the movement and what it is. So what is CCF? CCF, again, is a movement that was birthed last summer. There was a very, very large launch event that had over like 3,000 people attend. I'm going to put a link to the YouTube video that sort of summarizes the launch of the movement from last summer. But it's basically a fundraising model that's grounded in equity and social justice. Alex, can you go ahead to the next slide? Awesome. So it's a fundraising model that's grounded in equity and justice, and that means we prioritize the entire community over individual organizations, fostering a sense of belonging and interdependence. And we present our work not as individual transactions, but holistically, encouraging mutual support between nonprofits. Community-centric fundraising, this is a very key point, is not mutually exclusive to donor-centric fundraising. Donor-centric fundraising is traditional philanthropy or fundraising models that we've been taught for decades. A lot of donor-centric fundraising is still important and necessary and works to raise dollars that our orgs need. But dollars raised shouldn't be the only metric that we're using to determine success or to determine what works in our organizations. There are some places where donor-centric fundraising does not prioritize the community, and it just doesn't work for our communities. Next slide. So why is CCF not like a CFRE? Why is it not a certification? Why is it not an organization with an ED of itself and that sort of thing? CCF is truly a movement, just like BLM is a movement, just like Me Too is a movement. It's a movement that has a life of its own, and that's evolving how fundraising is done in the nonprofit sector globally, not just in the US, but in other countries as well. It's centered around community, and what that means is we want people to self-organize. So as you've heard Alex mention, and I've mentioned a couple times as well, most of the work is just centered around these online spaces that have been created throughout the pandemic, including the CCF Slack community, where people basically get to create their own conversations, ask questions, and then think through applications of these principles together, because it's not very prescriptive. There's no how-to manual of how to be a community-centric fundraiser or how to be a community-centric organization. It's really about creating strength and centering, especially people of color doing this work, who might have more lived experience with implementing these values predating the official launch of the movement last summer. Awesome. So why CCF? We're going to talk about why CCF was actually formed and what caused this founding council of 8 to 10 people in Seattle to birth this movement last summer. So in August 2018, there was a BIPOC fundraiser summit in Seattle. This basically was a gathering of different fundraisers in the Seattle area who were providing local qualitative data via conversation. These conversations basically centered around a lot of unhappiness with the sector and a lot of unhappiness with work. People were trying to leave their jobs, were getting burnt out with the development that they were doing, et cetera. This caused us in May 2019 to gauge put forth a formal survey to gauge perceptions of fundraising. This was a worldwide survey with quantitative data, and it included findings from over 2,000 fundraisers and nonprofit professionals that highlighted the thoughts and experiences of fundraisers. It was put together by one of the founding council members named Ana Rebecca Lopez, who is an evaluator in the Seattle area. And I'm going to go ahead and put some links to her infographics in the chat. So what did this survey tell us? The first major takeaway is that the majority of fundraisers and nonprofit professionals are unhappy and think fundraising practices and philosophies are harmful to nonprofits' work of addressing systemic injustice. While white and BIPOC folks generally agree that the current system is not working, a higher percentage of people of color are unhappy with the status quo. So this graphic on this slide shows that overall, everyone thought that the sector was doing work that was harmful or somewhat harmful, but a higher percentage of fundraisers of color thought that that was the case. The second major takeaway from this survey is that there is a decrease of diversity of fundraisers in the sector due to fundraising philosophies and practices that perpetuated the white savior complex. So over half of everyone that responded to the survey agreed with this statement, and then 38% of BIPOC respondents thought that current fundraising philosophies have led to a significant decrease of the diversity of the sector. And the third major takeaway, awesome, thanks, is that nearly all fundraisers and nonprofit professionals think the current fundraising philosophies and practices have led to an increase in white saviorism in the nonprofit sector. If you all are familiar with the podcast, The Ethical Rainmaker, it's started by one of the founders of the movement, Michelle Shireen Muri. In it, she has a couple episodes dedicated to discussing the racist roots of nonprofits and the birth of the nonprofit industry, or the third sector, as we call it. And it was truly born out of racism, right? It was white women staying at home, had nothing to do. They decided to start nonprofits. What we're seeing over time is that the practices that we continue to perpetuate in the nonprofit sector prior to CCF have continued to maintain that white saviorism and deepen it within white communities. So here we see that BIPOC folks and white folks are in agreement with this takeaway. So we took these three main takeaways, and from it, we birthed the CCF principles. And I'll pass it back to Alex to lead you through those core values of the movement.
Yeah, and one of the things we want to highlight, and you're going to see this, and we're going to kind of continue to touch back to this, is that these are principles. So this is not a code of conduct. These are not things that, oh, we must do it this certain way, and now we're going to spell out exactly what this looks like, and you have to sign on a dotted line that you agree to do. These are principles. These are things to ground in. These are questions that we should reflect on and ask ourselves. And I'm going to take you through the 10 principles. And then Rakhi, do you mind putting the wallpaper link up in the chat when we get to that section? So we even have there's some wallpaper options that you can have to use electronically, just to, again, sort of get yourself more familiar and comfortable with what these are as you ask those questions and start to think about the application. And then I'm going to show you at the end of this a spreadsheet that's kind of a checklist of, here are some ways to think about applying these, because I think one of the things we always struggle with, right, is when we think about something like this first statement, fundraising must be grounded in race, equity, and social justice. What is that actually going to look like, right? Well, how's that actually going to translate into how we organize our work, right? Or how we run a fundraising event, or how we design our strategy around fundraising. So we're going to share with you a spreadsheet that's also available on the CCF website for anyone. And I've actually shared it with a couple of my clients who are starting to explore really wanting to ground their fundraising in equity. And so I've shared this with them and said, this is some pretty intense stuff if we start really applying some of these things and using this applied actions checklist, but it's a place to start, and it's a place to start really thinking about this. So again, first one, fundraising must be grounded in race, equity, and social justice. Individual organizational missions are not as important as the collective community. Wow. I mean, that one just in and of itself, like when we sit back and think, and you all, as part of being in an alliance, you are starting on that, right? Because you are understanding that collectively what we do, what we're focused on, our community that we're forming is way more important than the individual mission. But it also challenges, as does number 3, our scarcity framework that many of us in fundraising operate from. If I don't get it, if my organization doesn't get it, what is that going to mean for us in our future? So this is pushing it and challenging this. Nonprofits are generous with and mutually supportive of one another. All who engage in strengthening the community are equally valued, whether volunteer, staff, donor, or board member, or community member, right? So everyone who is engaged in this, we're applying equal value. And this really gets at the tendency in traditional fundraising models to elevate the people who give the most, to treat their perspective and opinion as more valuable than others. This gets at that and asks us to start breaking down some of that hierarchy. Time is valued equally as money. And this is something we've got to, this kind of goes back to what Rakhi was talking about. We've got to move away from it all being about the dollars, right? What are we looking at in terms of time that people are giving and dedicating to the work? We treat donors as partners, and this means we are transparent, assume the best intentions, and occasionally have difficult conversations. I think this is coming up more and more for fundraisers as organizations take a stand on DEI-J or DEI-B, whatever your framework is. As a foundation, you're getting more questions. You're starting to have these conversations. So to think about, what does partnership look like? So it doesn't have to be combative. It doesn't have to be something where there's just always conflict. But if we are truly partners, then we can have those challenging conversations with each other. We foster a sense of belonging, not othering. We promote the understanding that everyone, donors, staff, funders, board members, and volunteers, personally benefit from engaging in the work of social justice. It's not just charity and compassion. And this gets at, if you've done any sort of study or work around dismantling white supremacy, this is a huge tenet that also aligns with that. We recognize that creating space for social justice and breaking down systemic racism in all areas benefits everyone, because it's just as damaging for the people at the top, the people who are sometimes part of the hierarchy at the top. It's just as damaging to them as it is to everyone else. And so we can recognize that it benefits everyone. It frees everyone when we start to approach this way. We see the work of social justice as holistic and transformative, not transactional. So this moves us out of, you give us money, we respond this way. It's all just about that, into what is this more holistic and transformative perspective. And we recognize that healing and liberation requires a commitment to economic justice. And so how does that fit into how we approach philanthropy, how we approach fundraising? I'll just pause there and say that I know when I joined those 3,000 people last July of 2020 in the launching of this, and I heard all this, I was in a very traditional fundraising role at that time and in a large organization. And I remember, we're all working from home. I remember coming off of that call, hearing this and being equally excited and inspired and feeling like I finally found people who are asking those questions that I've been asking myself and that I didn't always feel supported in asking. But I also felt like, I don't know what this is going to look like for me. How am I going to stay in a traditional fundraising framework? And now that I know, right, what it can look like. So if you're feeling some of that, I would just say that I think that's a really common response of, wow, okay, this feels exciting, but also overwhelming. And so we just want to acknowledge that and let that sit and percolate a little bit, sit with that process, that's going to be part of this journey. And everybody's kind of individual response and where you are is different. And so I want to just encourage you to kind of let that sink in and acknowledge that I think many of us have felt that same way. And if you join the Slack channels, you see a lot of that conversation. What do I do with this, right? Like my organization isn't ready, or I'm not ready, or where am I supposed to go with that? And that's why we have to be in community together to explore these things. So I think, Rakhi, if you could put she may have already done it. There it is. So again, this just kind of gives you those principles to sit with, to process, to think about, to iterate on. And again, they are principles. It's not a code of conduct. It's not a code of ethics, but just grounding principles for you. So told you that we would also briefly touch on the aligned actions list. So I'm just going to let you, there's a lot of text on this screen. I'll let you all look at this. This is just one piece of it. So you can see this is under the ground your fundraising and race equity and social justice. Here are some specific what's that you can do that fall under that. And then you could use this sheet to then also plan out, okay, when are we going to do this? Who's going to be involved? The last question, which is, how is this going to actually happen? How are we going to do it? So I'll give you a moment to read that over. And I think Rakhi has also put that, put that link in the chat. So you can click on all these links and save all of that for when we get done. Yeah, and Kate's letting us know all the links will get sent out to attendees after today's session as well. So if you haven't been able to click on all of them in real time, we will get them to you. So as you're processing that, I'm just going to ask this question and then I'll come back to that sheet so you can look at it. What questions, reflections, ideas do you have at this point? And you can put those in the chat. You can unmute if you'd like to ask something. That's fine at this point. We just want to give a moment for any reflection or questions that you might have for Rakhi or I. And I'm going to go back to this so people can keep reading it. Reflections, what are you thinking, feeling? You can put it in the chat. Yes, we're gonna get to some stories of some things that some application of the principles. Is that what you're asking, Riley? Okay, yeah, yep, we're gonna get to that. Any other thoughts? You may just be taking it all in, and that's just fine. Yeah, where do we start? What if we get it wrong? Rakhi, do you want to respond to that, or do you want to save that for some of what we're getting to? You're muted, right? Oh, there you go.
Yeah, so I would say there isn't a such thing as getting this wrong, right? Wherever you're starting is your starting point, and the small tweaks that you can make to the way your organization is operating and conducting its fundraising are going to make all the difference. I also want to just like start preparing you all for like reframing what a success story looks like when it comes to CCF. It may not be that like you start implementing CCF principles into your work as an organization and the next month you raise more dollars. It's not going to be that linear, and part of reframing the metric of success is a part of embracing these principles as well. What does this look like beyond project collaboration? Malia, that's a great question. I have a couple of examples I think today that just like sort of mention what different orgs have done, but there's a ton of examples of orgs collaborating on the CCF Slack community, where folks are just getting together locally, and when there is mission overlap, they're either sharing resources, sharing grant opportunities, sharing donors, passing donors between them. So all of that stuff is happening on micro levels for sure. What about all white organizations that serve an all white area, wealthy area? We are very small. So like I mentioned before, I think CCF is a misnomer. Community-centric fundraising should just be community-centric nonprofits. And I think that applies at all levels of the nonprofit sector, from funders to organizations, to staff, to boards of directors, to donors. So Sarah, I think you can still implement a lot of what we're talking about by educating your donors and helping shift the way they're approaching their philanthropy by giving to your organization, even if you are serving an all-white organization. That is your community, and you can still strengthen that community.
So a couple of the other questions, Rakhi, we got are, how do you get your board and major donors to co-sponsor these changes without losing their support?
My opinion here is like they also just need to know about the movement, right? Especially after the racial justice awakening that happened last year, I think a lot of folks are looking to make shifts, and they don't quite know how to. So by exposing them to this new model, the more stakeholders you have on board, including your board of directors, the more you can make these changes at all levels of your organization.
Yeah. Trying to absorb, starting to think about as someone who works as a funder, how to use these principles to evaluate where we invest and what orgs we fund.
Oh, wow. That's something that the founding council, we've been planning this for a year, is basically a convening for funders, Stephanie, where people like Vu Lei, who writes the famous blog Nonprofit AF, like really wants to speak directly to funders and explain like different models that sort of turned philanthropy on its head in terms of who's getting the money, and how to evaluate folks or organizations that are getting the money. So I will share one example today, and then we should definitely continue this conversation because it's something I'm thinking a lot about as well.
I think one of the other things to just think about, going back to a couple of the questions about, lose the potential of losing funding, or is that, this is part of a larger, hopefully, conversation that you're having within your organization about if we are going to say as an organization that we ground in diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, or equity, inclusion, and belonging, and it's going to live itself out in these ways in our organization, then we have to be prepared for these challenging conversations, right? Where donors may feel confusion, or maybe it doesn't align with where they are in other areas of their life. This is why the partnership and relationship is so critical, because we can have those challenging conversations in the context of real relationship. If everything has been very transactional, it's much harder to talk about these things with someone. And so I would even, I've made this recommendation to a couple of organizations when they're talking about, okay, how do we even start having this conversation with our board or with our donors? Think about the people you have the strongest relationships with, where you have had other conversations about challenging things in your organization, and start there, and start with inviting them to something, to listen in on a workshop, or sharing some ideas with them ahead of time and saying, hey, I'd love to talk with you about this and what this might look like in the context of our organization. And be prepared to facilitate that conversation along. And even if there's pushback or resistance, to not see that as, oh, well, then that just means we have to back off completely because they're probably going to pull their funding. But then even asking some of those questions about, in the short term, if we did lose a funder who really was not aligned with who we are as an organization, are we willing to do that? These are the real questions, right? This is where the kind of rubber meets the road, to take the longer view of doing what we know is right, aligning with who we say we are, and trusting that means that there are other people in the community, that would want to join and support, who may not be part of our circle right now. So there is some real, I get it, the tension there and the feeling of risk around that. That also, I think, comes a little bit out of our scarcity framework, right? And we have to push back against that constantly. We got another question about, are those CCF principles being added upon?
So there's been no talk amongst the founding council members of adding principles. In fact, the original list of principles that was published by VU on the blog Nonprofit AF a couple of years ago was actually only 9 principles. And they added a 10th when they refined things to formally publish them last summer. So the principles won't necessarily be added upon, but what we are adding upon is the number of resources and folks that are sort of taking the principles and trying to make them more actionable for folks to implement in their work. For example, last week I just gave a presentation on making the fundraising ask, but making it more CCF. So I talked about different types of asks: end of year appeals, written appeals, in-person events, and one-on-one donor meetings, and how to approach those from a CCF lens, with a little bit more specificity in terms of these are the steps you can take to approach it from a CCF lens versus a donor-centric lens.
So Rakhi, we've only got about 35 minutes left, so we probably need to keep going.
Yes.
And I would just say, keep putting your questions. If you have other things that come to you, we'll try to get to them at the end. We may have to move through our other kind of reflection time to allow time for the breakouts. So Rakhi, I'll let you kind of tell me what you want to do to ensure that we get done on time so folks can go to their next session.
Awesome. We can go ahead and get started. for now. Yeah, there we go. Okay, cool. So this is sort of the portion where I'm gonna share some high level examples. I'm not gonna get too into the details of each of these examples because they could be their whole like 90-minute podcast or interview of themselves. But I'm gonna talk about how CCF can be applied at different levels of the nonprofit sector and then with different groups of stakeholders. So the first example I want to share is fundraisers convening with other fundraisers and really trying to adapt these principles for fundraiser only spaces. So for those that might be familiar with AFP or the Association of Fundraising Professionals, obviously they have chapters all across the globe. And in St. Louis, one member of the movement, Rachel D'Souza Siebert, basically dismantled the way her AFP chapter was doing their traditional Philanthropy Day event, which is a very common event amongst AFP chapters, where they traditionally celebrate majority white wealthy donors that are giving loads of money into the community versus prioritizing time and other contributions in the community as well. So Rachel did is she basically took the Philanthropy Day, she was sharing the event last year, and she completely changed it around to where they were celebrating activists and folks that were really doing the on the ground work and not just celebrating philanthropists. She really redefined philanthropy for the AFP St. Louis chapter. And it was a very successful event where that really took hold, and they're doing a very similar thing this year as well. And it looks very different than other Philanthropy Day events across the country. So I've gone ahead and put the little pamphlet that they put together for that event last year into the chat. Well, you're welcome to look at it. Michelle Shireen Muri, again, one of the founders of the movement, was also their speaker and basically challenged them as the speaker to redefine philanthropy and embrace CCF principles, even as folks that are just donors. The next level is at organizations, which is probably the most common use case of CCF principles. And there are dozens and dozens of examples here that I could have picked, but I just wanted to highlight a few different ones. So we did a workshop with the AFP chapter in Virginia, the BAFRI in Virginia, which is another group for fundraising professionals. And we had a couple case studies from Virginia Community Voice and Legal Aid Justice Center, where they basically taken CCF principles and rewritten them and adapted them for their internal organizations, and then shared those new principles with all levels of the organization, from communities that they're serving to boards of directors to funders, to help guide their fundraising. So this includes when they say no to gifts, when they end a relationship with a donor, things like that. So this is just like an example of taking CCF principles and then doing your own thing with them. Another thing that a lot of organizations are trying to figure out are ethical gift policies. And there are a wide range of interpretations of how CCF, what CCF would say about an ethical gift policy. Some folks are under the impression that if an organization is led by people of color, then they should be able to accept money from any corporation or any source, because really it's just another form of reparations. Other folks are saying we are going to decline funds from X, Y, and Z, no matter what. Other possible moves here are like redirecting corporations that want to give you money that you are rejecting to other organizations that need the funds more than you. So that's another example of how nonprofits are choosing to be mutually supportive of one another. Another example of an organization that is just doing, again, micro changes into the way that they're doing things every year. Texas After Violence Project, it's a nonprofit based in Austin, where I live. They chose to not participate in the annual Austin Giving Day, just like most local giving days, which usually was a big part of their annual budget. So they chose to forego it because they are a majority white organization, and they wanted to redirect funds to more grassroots BIPOC-led orgs on that day. So they just completely abstained and instead sent out email newsletters asking their donors to support other organizations in town for that day, knowing that they would have other opportunities throughout the year to solicit funds. The next group of stakeholders are funders. So this definitely speaks to one of the questions that we talked about from Stephanie. So this is one of my favorite funders. They're based in the Bay Area and in Seattle, and they have a very community-based approach to funding work. So they fund work specifically led by like subsets of communities, whether that's religious communities, folks of color, hyper local work, and they go through an extensive vetting process where they interview these organizations, they do site visits, etc. Once communities are, or once organizations are selected to receive funding, the way that their funding model works, which is very interesting, is they basically put like organizations, whether they're serving similar communities or have similar missions, together in a cohort and give that cohort of organizations a pot of money. So like say $2 million over 5 years. And it is up to those organizations to determine how they're going to split those funds up. It's a very interesting model that is definitely turning philanthropy on its head, and is pioneering some really important work that usually wouldn't get that level of funding. They might get a $10,000 grant, but never that amount of money. Awesome. And then there's other examples of the CCF principles in action at other levels as well, including donors. The Black Land Collective, for example, is a group of folks that are basically doing land back and giving it to Black farmers, and really embracing like them removing themselves from the formula of the nonprofit sector. Awesome. So I know those were just like very, very high level examples. You might be like, what? I'm still so confused. If any of those really piqued your interest, I really encourage you to Google them and dig deeper. But I just want to give you a couple of different types of examples to sort of cover the breadth of CCF work that's out there. We're now going to do a liberating structure called 15% solutions. For those that are unfamiliar with liberating structures, they're basically a set of facilitated activities that help encourage deep reflection, communication, and collaboration in spaces without using a hierarchy. So the point of the 15% solutions activity is to move away from blockage, negativism, and powerlessness, help people discover their power, share actionable ideas that help one another, and remember that everyone has unused capacity and resources. So there's a saying, there's 15% left for the taking. Everyone in their roles, no matter what organization you work for or what your specific job title is, everyone has a locus of control where they can make certain decisions without having to consult anyone else. So the point of this activity is for you to determine what is in your locus of control, what is something small that you can start doing immediately without having to convince anyone else or get anyone else's buy-in, that helps you get on the path to more community-centric fundraising. Next slide. So like I mentioned, we're moving away from blockage. Awesome. So what is a 15% insight? It's always there for the asking and for the taking. Like I mentioned, you don't have to, it doesn't hinge upon anyone else's approval. It's the most unused or unnoticed source of influence. Big things might emerge from this small change via the butterfly effect. So you might start doing something small differently within your daily work, and a colleague might notice that and also start doing the same thing. Reinventing the wheel is okay. We're not trying to be pioneers, as problematic as that term is, in this work. We're just trying to make small ripples in our little bubble. This activity is going to add to your understanding of what is possible. You'll be shocked by the level of creativity that comes out of these small group conversations. It's also going to help you develop a clear common purpose when it comes to this movement, and boundaries that generate coherence among many other solutions. And a lot of folks that we've done this activity with have mentioned that it's very energizing, motivating, and liberating, because you sort of stop thinking about what you can't do in terms of changing the way your organization functions and start thinking more about what you can do. So things that you can start doing immediately, like I mentioned, you're going to create momentum. We're going to show that there's no reason to wait around until there's a how-to manual for CCF, because there honestly may not ever be a how-to manual. That's sort of the point, is that the vagueness and the high levelness of the principles are there by design. Focusing on what's within your control, and then shifting a few grains of sand, which is another metaphor that we're using, to trigger a landslide within your organizations and really shift the whole landscape. So some examples of 15% solutions that you all might come up with during this time, or that you can start using as like examples of things that might be in your locus of control. A new volunteer meeting. How can you restructure the way that you're onboarding people into your organization from a more community-centric lens? Does that mean shifting from more deficit-based language to describe your affected communities to strengths-based language? Does that mean really explaining to volunteers what you're intending to do with shifting your organization's culture to be more equitable and just? Does that mean telling volunteers or really embedding them into the communities that you're serving? A thank you letter. How are you changing the way that you're asking for money? How are you changing the way that you're stewarding relationships? Are you thanking people differently based on levels of gifts that they're making? Are you using transactional language where you say that for $20 you are buying a kid their books for the month? What are small tweaks you can make to your thank you letter that you send probably on a regular basis that can start moving towards a more community-centric lens? An annual report. I could give a whole talk about annual reports, but they can be very problematic. Everything from segmenting donors by level to prioritizing certain donors based on bigger gifts to using data to, again, point out the deficits in the communities that you're serving versus the strengths, and not pointing to the systemic problems, but the problems that individuals themselves are creating for themselves. These are all tweaks that these are all things you can move away from in your effort to become more community-centric. Give Big, which is another example of a local giving day. Give Big is the name of the one in Seattle. How can you change the way that you're participating in your local annual giving day, whether it's abstaining, whether it's working collaboratively with other organizations, changing the levels that you have, etc. Changing donors to supporters, small language tweak, and then changing the way you define a major donor. Is a major donor someone that has given a ton of time to your organization? Is a major donor someone that's given $10 for the past 10 years? Is a major donor someone that's written you a $10,000 check? That's really something that for you to define and challenge the way that you've traditionally defined those things. And then everything that Alex shared on the aligned actions list, those all could be micro things that might be in your locus of control that you can start shifting tomorrow to make your organization more community-centric. Awesome. So in a moment, Alex is going to go ahead and put us into breakout groups, and we're going to ask you to sort of self-decide a few different roles in these breakout groups. Okay. So there's going to be one person speaking at a time. The note taker, we're going to go ahead and forego this for today. We only have about 25 participants. So if you want to take notes for your personal use, feel free, but we won't be collecting any notes. So if you need to take out some pen and paper or open up a Google Doc, feel free to do that. Timekeeper, it will be really important for one person to keep track of time just because we are running a little bit behind schedule. And then the way this activity is going to work is as one person is speaking, the rest of the folks in the room will be consultants. So consultants mean that you are not offering advice that is not asked for. If the person asked a specific question and they are seeking advice, you can provide advice, but really your job is asking clarifying questions that help the person arrive at some type of 15% solution for them in their role and in their work. Awesome. So this is going to be the breakdown of the time for 15% solutions. You'll have about 20 minutes in your breakout rooms of 3 to 4 people. For 2 minutes, before you even get into the breakout rooms, we're going to give you 2 minutes of silent time to brainstorm what is your 15%, where do you have discretion and freedom to act, and what can you do without more resources or authority. Again, I've given you a few examples. If those weren't inspiring to you, you can look at the aligned actions list that we pasted in the chat earlier. We can repaste it as well. What is something that you can start doing tomorrow that you don't need to ask anyone else to approve? Then once you get into your breakout rooms for 2 minutes, you go ahead and do some intros, name pronouns, and then assign the roles. Who's going to speak first, who's going to be the timekeeper, and then who's starting off as the consultants. For 8 minutes, you're going to go ahead and do a small group idea share where you're just going to sort of list out any ideas that come to mind of things that people could start doing tomorrow as a 15% solution around CCF and their work. This is going to just be like people spitting out various things. Then for the next 8 minutes, group members will provide consultation. So the speaker will start speaking about tomorrow, I will start doing this. I think my boss will let me start doing this tweak tomorrow in our appeal letter. And then the consultants can provide advice or ask clarifying questions to really make sure the person has thought through their next move. And then for the last minute, we encourage you to stay connected by sharing contact information or your LinkedIn's if you so choose.
So Rakhi, I think we're gonna have to do this in about 15 minutes, just so we have time to come back and close out. And then
Okay.
Jenna, do you have groups ready to go, or do you want me to do the breakouts?
They're all ready to go.
Awesome. All right, let's go. I think Rakhi, we can probably stay. Oh, she wants us to go into that room with Kate. Yep. Okay.
Oh, I just put you guys in a room so that way you didn't have to leave. I didn't realize. Oops, Alex went anyway.
Yeah, if you want to move her back, that'd be great. I think she got
Okay.
confused.
Move to main session. Alrighty. Alrighty, I'm trying to, okay, there we go. Sorry, I didn't realize there was an option to not put you guys in a room, so I put you in your own room.
Oh,
thinking
that's
that
all right.
you could
You're
enjoy,
good. You're
and
good.
then forced you back here. So
It's okay.
Hey, Jenna, can you pause recording so Jenny doesn't have to edit this?
Awesome. Welcome back. We apologize for cutting your time short, and I know we had to sort of deviate from the structure we laid out, but I highly encourage you to look into liberating structures yourself if you're ever facilitating any type of training or workshop for your teams. So now we're just going to go through sort of what you all brainstormed in your breakout rooms. It can be very similar to the ideas that we shared with you before letting you go. They could be really different. So go ahead and just paste in the chat, what is your 15%? Where do you have discretion and freedom to act? And what can you do without more resources or authority today or tomorrow? So what did you determine is your 15% solution when it comes to CCF?
Or even if, we recognize there may have been some technical issues with folks coming in and out of rooms. So even if it's just, this is where you started thinking about it when Rakhi was taking us through this approach. And so even if you didn't have a chance to talk about it with the group, if it's just something that you were thinking about, okay, this is where my 15% is, this is something that could look different that I want to start exploring, go ahead and put that in the chat, even if you were not able to get into the room. We just want to hear what some of the ideas were, what's kind of percolating for you. Here we go.
Awesome. Exploring definition of major donors. A student CCF organization. Wow, I haven't heard that yet. That's awesome. But that makes a lot of sense, right? Like folks like start learning the basics of the nonprofit sector in college or as students. So that makes a lot of sense. How can this look different for a small all-volunteer organization with a working board? Yeah, fascinating. Yeah. Creating promotional material in Spanish, not just English. Yep. Encouraging holistic connection to funded projects and communities. Yes. Gender justice is definitely a part of the social justice we're talking about. Wait for one or two more 15% solutions. I might have integrating language. Yes. I really think something that's we're not talking about enough is how to get donors on board with this, because really, if your donors have that much power in donor-centric fundraising, if they're on board with CCF, that's going to really give you a lot of momentum to shift or get higher ups in your organizations to buy into it. Helping raise the awareness about environmental justice. Yes, that speaks to sort of really changing the way you talk about your mission and your work and addressing systemic injustices versus micro level interpersonal injustices. Other quick ideas that are coming to mind, compensating people, especially for communities that you're serving when they are sharing stories with you for appeal letters, for events, making sure that you are asking them questions like, how long can we use your story for? In what context can we use our story? And giving them final edit access to make sure that you're practicing more ethical storytelling. Again, that's a completely different workshop that we can go really, really in depth in, but that's another small tweak you could start making. Identifying BIPOC members of our community to engage with partners or future board members. Yes. Consider paying board members that are from the communities that you're serving. If that's what it takes to get their voices at that level. As a funder and someone who runs our RFP webinar, stop any references to cash as king. Yes, cash as king is definitely one of the more problematic statements out there, right? Cash shouldn't be king. Yes, we live in a capitalist society. Yes, we need cash to function and to achieve our missions and do our work. And how can we start valuing time as equally as money? Awesome, great. Well, I feel like y'all have generated a lot of solutions here that I haven't heard before in the workshops that I've done similar to this. We did want to leave you with a couple ways to directly engage with the CCF movement. Again, like I mentioned, most of this work is happening online, remotely through people in different locations. The movement is centered around a Slack community. It currently has 4,000 plus people. I am also the moderator, so if you see my name a lot, that's why. To join that Slack community, you can just go to tinyurl.com/CCF Slack, I believe. There's also a link to the Slack community on this slide. You can also connect with Alex and I on LinkedIn. We're both consultants. We both do this work and have different areas of expertise and are happy to chat through more things that come up for you in this work. Oh yeah, go ahead.
No, that's what I was going to say. Thank you, Rakhi, for just taking us through this and offering so many specific examples and answering the questions. And yeah, I just always a privilege to get to partner with Rakhi on something. We were excited to be able to be back together for this. And thank you to the Alliance for bringing us together and inviting us to join in this conversation. And so Kate, unless Rakhi has anything else, I'll turn it over to you to close us out.
Thank you both. Thank you, Rakhi. Thank you, Alex. I've got some housekeeping, and then I have one ask of all of us that are left here real quick. So thanks for joining us today. There's some reminders about social media. You can find your next session on HOVA. We are convening sessions for the day. If you're in Baltimore, there's a happy hour happening. And in Richmond, in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, there's also another happy hour happening this evening. So my ask is, Alex, if you could stop the screen share, if those that are willing to come on camera would do so, and help me give a round of applause for our speakers and introducing us to these important principles today. And I just appreciate all of your time and attention on something that's incredibly important to the future of our organizations and our movement as a whole. So thank you all. And we'll be sure to make sure, I think you can go back in and check, and we're going to have the links permanently kind of attached to HOVA, and we'll make sure you have access to all of those in the future. But thank you, Rakhi. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you.
Great Wednesday.
Thank you all. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks all.